Now, this panel, of course, is going to look at the energy trends and really have a look at the economic outlook. So we're going to take a big picture look at what's going on in the world, and then we're going to look regionally and see, again, maybe some of the plans that you have in place, see how economically feasible they are. And then in the session after this, you'll have perhaps some answers from the bankers where we put them on the spot as well. So I'd like to ask our panel now to please join us as well. I'd be very grateful if we can be joined by Jim Hughes, the Executive Officer of First Solar. Jim is also going to take part in this discussion, one of the key players in the solar industry. Thank you so much. We're absolutely delighted to have with us here today to the Chairman of the Clean Energy Business Council, Dr. Nasser Saidi, if he can join us as well. And to round off our wonderful panel here, and Marius Maratheftis, please. Marius is the Chief Global Economist for Standard Chartered. So let's get down to business here, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Now, we will also have an opportunity, hopefully, to take some questions from you. And you can see we have our high-tech iPads here in place, so if there is a question that you want to put to our audience, please take the time to do this. Marius, I'd like to start with you because I think, first of all, let's put it in perspective in terms of what's going on in the world, pretty much. How is the global economic picture looking out there when we look then particularly what perhaps place renewables, and give us a big feel for what's going on here as well, closer to home?
Yes, let's look at the big themes. Let's look at China, first of all. The big headline in newspapers when I looked this morning is that we had the lowest GDP growth in China since the 1990s, since 1990. It sounds horrible, but it isn't. So let's discuss that. Let's talk a little bit about policy. Interest rate hikes in the United States affecting sentiment everywhere. Let's talk a bit about fundamentals, what's happening fundamentally in the world economy, and let's finish off with confidence and the region. So China. Lowest growth since 1990. It sounds scary, but think about it. This lowest growth since the 1990s is still around 7%. And we need to take into consideration that China today is not the same country as it was in 1990. It was a small economy in the 1990s. It's the second largest economy in the world today. It cannot keep growing at 15%. It needs to slow down. It's just like a car. I was driving from Dubai today. On the long road, you're driving 140 kilometers an hour. You cannot accelerate much further. If you're stopped and you're stand still, you can accelerate a lot. Well, growth is acceleration. The faster you drive, the less the acceleration in the car. The same thing applies to the economy. The same thing applies to China. The second point I want to make is policy. It's a big different, it's a different game today. We had low interest rates in the US for very long, and since December we had the first interest rate hike in the United States since June 2006. So after more than 9 years, we had interest rates going up in the US. It's an important event. People underestimated that event. They still underestimate it. I think it's very significant to see the Fed hiking interest rates. I also think that it was a big mistake to hike interest rates. It's affecting markets, it's affecting the economies, and for this reason, I think that the Fed cannot really hike much further. I expect one more interest rate hike in the US. That's good news. If we have much more aggressive interest rate hikes in the United States, it will trigger more problems. The market expects more. The Fed is telling us it's going to do more. I don't think they will be able to do more. So there should be some improvement from the Fed pausing its hikes after March this year. Fundamentals. What should we expect in terms of growth in 2016? I think growth will be disappointing in 2016. It feels a bit slow, and I think growth will be flat, more or less the same as what we did in 2015. So in terms of growth, there's nothing to get too excited about. Finally, confidence. Confidence is very important in financial markets, and it's also very important in economics. And today, confidence is driving everything. Look at oil prices. Oil prices at this level are not sustainable. Oil prices at this level are not reflective of fundamentals. What drives markets today is sentiment. And I think the two major factors that affect sentiment today are first China and second the Federal Reserve in the United States. So to conclude, I'm slightly more optimistic today. Sentiment is bad today, but I think eventually markets will realize that China is not collapsing. China is still an engine of growth for the world economy. And the second reason why I'm optimistic is because I do not expect the Fed to do what it said it will do. I think one more hike by the Fed, and that's it, with possibly the Fed cutting interest rates towards year end. So let's survive this negativity today, and I think 3-4 months from now, sentiment should begin to improve.
Well, you're a breath of fresh air to wake us up this morning telling us that life in China is not that bad. I mean, and exactly, wouldn't anybody else in the world welcome 7%, particularly the Americans, with or without their interest rate hike? We'll talk more about that, Marius, but thank you so much for putting it in perspective for us. Dr. Saidi, you are with the Clean Energy Business Council now, but you come from, tremendous background, in politics, in a ministerial position, as a minister, also as a chief economist. So you have something to say about this, I'm sure, as well. But talk to us a little bit about the change in demographics, the urbanization, and that structural change that you see will actually have a big impact on the growth of energy in the future.
Sure. Assalamu alaikum. Good morning first. I want to give you a health warning. First, I'm an economist, so you have to be careful when you listen to what we say, despite what Marius was saying as well. And second, I come as an advocate of clean energy. I chair something called the Clean Energy Business Council. So you already know that my message is going to be pro-clean energy and clean technology, so you're forewarned. Let me come back a little bit to our region first, because it's important. Marius gave the big picture. The fact that China is slowing is not actually a very big deal, as you were saying. It is now the second biggest economy in the world and still growing at 7% and probably continue growing at that rate. What it does signify, of course, is a very important shift in the global economy towards emerging markets, towards developing economies. And that's an enormous shift that's happened in global economic geography over the past 20 years. And that shift is a permanent shift and is going to have implications for the energy market for decades to come. And I'll come back to that a bit later. I just want to mention a couple of words about our region before we get into the demographics. First, our region is facing what I call the oil price tsunami. Oil prices today are at a 12-year low. We're hitting below $30 per barrel. The implications, of course, are that oil revenues, both for governments and export revenues, are down. We expect the hit in the 2015 was about a $360 billion hit to the economies of the regions. It's very substantial. GCC governments lost another $260 billion. That has meant that they are now running budget deficits and they are now running current account deficits. For a country like Saudi Arabia, this hit is a very big one. Budget deficits last year were estimated around 19 to 20%. And what this means, of course, is that governments, and in particular on the fiscal side, will need to adjust. So we have a picture whereby growth overall is going to slow in our part of the world. And it's not only in the oil sector, it's also in the non-oil sector, because the non-oil sector is very much affected by demand by government spending. So although we call it the non-oil sector, much of it is related to the oil sector through the channel of government spending on construction, health, education, a whole number of sectors. That means that the growth prospects for our part of the world are going to be lower in 2016. So don't expect anything much more than 2 to 2.5% in my view. UAE, where we are, will do a little bit better because it has a more diversified economy. But let's look at some of the implications. It's not only the oil price, which is a matter of concern, it's also the fact that the countries of the region are pegged to the US dollar at a time at which the US dollar has been appreciating against major currencies in the world. The net result of that is that The non-oil sector tends to suffer. So things like tourism and services become more expensive to the rest of the world. So we have two shocks, really. One is the strong US dollar, which is hurting the non-oil sector, and as well the oil economy. So moving forward, expect governments to adjust to that. And I'll then bring us to what it means for the energy market. The adjustment is going to mean that you're going to have to look at fiscal consolidation. Governments will have to review their spending plans. And we know already that they're going to introduce taxation. So expect a value-added tax, a VAT, within about 2 years, by 2017, 2018, maybe earlier if they can move quickly. You'll have excise taxes now coming in. This is a big change for the countries of the Gulf. We have not had that in the past. So we're establishing tax regimes. But at the same time, and this is where it's important for us, subsidies, fossil fuel subsidies are getting cut. And expect those fossil fuel subsidies to be phased out over time. This is very important because they're a big burden on the economies and the budgets of governments in the region. If you look at the overall costs of very cheap fossil fuel, it's not only the cost of subsidizing, it's also that it encourages a lot of wasteful consumption, a lot of energy-intensive activities. So as you cut down the subsidies, there's going to have to be a big transformation in the economies of the region towards less energy-intensive activities. And what that will mean is that we now have a fantastic opportunity to really give a big push to renewables. And we're seeing that despite low fossil fuel prices, the interest in renewables, in clean technology, in clean energy is at its strongest. So if we look at investment in renewable energy, it's been at its highest, in fact, in 2015. So one of the major themes, I think, which is going to be driving trends in the next few years will be three major things. First, at a global level, is the demographics, the fact that you have young populations in emerging economies, you've got rapid urbanization. All of that is going to mean that the energy market is going to shift towards developing economies. So if you look forward at where the investment is going to be made, for example, in power, it's estimated that up to 2040, over $12 trillion is going to be spent in power generation. But out of that 12 trillion, more than 8 of it is going to be in emerging markets, in the developing economies of the world. That's our part of the world. It's also going to mean that as that happens, you're getting a transformation of those economies. And it's also going to mean that energy efficiency is going to become much more important as we move forward. So 4 things I would point to. The big shift in economic geography, which means that energy is going to shift towards developing economies. Number 2, a big shift towards renewable energies as their cost goes down and as COP21 commitments start coming in. Third, energy efficiency is the low-hanging fruit, which we can all benefit from, but particularly in developing countries and particularly in the GCC countries. And the 4th item, extremely important, is clean energy financing. This is an area which is at its beginning, but the scope for shifting away from traditional financing, that is through banks, to using the markets, green bonds, green sukuk, and the like, is going to be a big transformation for the banking and financial industry.
And a lot of that, I'd like to touch more in detail on that at the moment. Jim, when we listen to Dr. Saidi's analysis of what's going on in the region, good news, as he says, a time to take advantage of the shift towards renewables. And when we look at the tremendous work that you've already been doing here, we look around this region, there's a lot of commitment to new projects, a lot of commitment to big projects. You're involved already in some. How do you see this playing out? Is this realistic when we look on the one hand that there's less money in the budgets of all of these governments in the region, but on the other hand there's a political commitment to really move the renewable agenda? What do you think, Jim?
We believe it's very realistic. There's 2 impacts that are a little bit unanticipated as we've seen the oil price drop. One is, as Dr. Naisi already referenced, subsidies are being pulled out on the fossil fuel side. When I was speaking 3 years ago, people would say, what keeps you up at night? And one of the scenarios I would talk about was extremely low oil prices, which lowered the relative cost of fossil fuels. What I didn't anticipate when I was making those comments several years ago was the extent to which governments would have the foresight to use the low oil prices as an opportunity to remove subsidy on the fossil fuel side, particularly liquid fuel generation. And that has allowed the true cost of that power to be reflected in the marketplace, which makes renewables more attractive. The other is that as oil prices have reduced, the available return on investment from investing capital into fossil fuel development has come down, and the relative return on investment into renewable energy has either stayed the same or gone up. And that has mobilized a lot of interest from a capital markets perspective in the renewables in the region. Governments recognize that while renewables are a heavy capital cost upfront, they have reduced the operating cost from that point forward. And furthermore, that reduction is a domestic natural resource, just the same as hydrocarbons are. So the MENA region, the Gulf region, has surprised to the upside for us over the last several years. And in most of my public comments recently, I have said we expect it will continue to surprise to the upside. It's one of the areas of the world that when we talk about our business, where we see the keys to the future, this is clearly one of the regions where we see that to be the case.
Super well. In fact, it moves me nicely on to Dr. Belhoul now, because he's got a few big projects in the works. Now, Masdar had, over the last few years, to really, in the last 10 years almost, really established itself as a very much an international player. But from what you're saying today, to a bit more focused, closer to home, and I see there's some projects you're currently working on. Why this shift?
I think, as Jim has rightfully pointed out, the business case for renewables in the region is very strong. The policy is in place. If you go back in history, Abu Dhabi was the first to set renewable energy targets. That was back in 2006. But then in 2011, Dubai next door also set targets. And last year in 2015, the UAE, as a federal target, has also put a target in place. So on one hand, you're seeing on the policy side a growing interest to increase renewables into the energy mix. Secondly, the demand is in this region. We're expecting demand to double by 2030. Third point is the point that Jim has alluded to, which is the business case, the commercial viability. Solar as well in our region makes perfect sense because the power generation profile matches demand. Our peak demand is driven by the air conditioning, so it's during midday and during summer. That falls nicely with the generation profile of solar PV. So in this region, it makes perfect sense to use solar energy in the region. Many countries also import their energy sources. A good example is the example in Jordan. We have inaugurated the Tafila wind project. It's the first wind project, utility scale, in all of the Middle East. That project actually saves the government $50 million annually. So again, renewable energy not only displaces carbon emissions, not only does it save you money, but it also gives you independence. Countries right now, from political standpoints, are trying to understand that they need to get their own independent power, and that can only be achieved through renewables. So in summary, we're very optimistic about the region, optimistic about North Africa and the Middle East as a whole.
Marius, when you talk about the reduction in, well, obviously the oil price has led some of this. The budgets are just not there anymore. In fact, they've been worse than halved, less than that. So when we look at the spending that needs to be there, again, as I say, that political will is there in terms of renewables. We're in a transitionary period where we have to look at the diversification of energy. Oil is not going to go away. We need a lot of gas. We need all that. But how important is it, that we keep an eye on the growth of renewables for an economy, do you think, at the same time sort of running in parallel to fossil fuel, because for the next few years we're going to need oil to actually fuel the economy?
Yeah, I think I need to talk a little bit about market failures here, because Market failures
regionally.
happen in a few
Regionally you're talking
instances,
about.
regionally
Okay.
and globally as well in the economy, when the cost of using something to society is much bigger than the cost that is incurred by the private individual using what they use. So the cost of using fossil fuels is much bigger because of the pollution, because of the damage it makes to the environment, and that's not reflected in the price of fossil fuels. And this is where the market fails. The market fails to incorporate this big social cost on the price of fuels. So if we leave it to markets to develop renewables, if we just leave it to the free market mechanism to go ahead with green energy, there is a good chance that at times when the price of hydrocarbons falls so low, fossil fuels, renewable energy and green energy might look less attractive. So this big drop in oil prices could be seen as a disincentive to invest in renewable energy. This is a case and a situation where the market fails to do what is right for the world and what is right for society. We have the market failing in the provision of education, the provision of policing, the provision of defense. This is another case where the free market fails. So it's very important to see governments and policymakers taking a lead into making investment in renewable energy still attractive. And I think it's fascinating to see Abu Dhabi taking a leading role in this field. It's not surprising, it's fascinating, because the role of the government and government-related entities in Abu Dhabi is very big. And the role of these entities in hydrocarbon-based economy tends to be very big. And I think it's good to see an economy where the government sector and government-related entities play a big role, taking advantage of that and leading the way into green energy. Because if it was left to a perfectly competitive free market, the chances are that the free market would have failed us and the cost would have been paid by our kids and our grandchildren later on.
Dr. Balhoul, when you look at the policy and the strategy of the government, this was in place before the dramatic drop in the oil price. And again, I see the passion from all of the related government entities here. From Masdar has been working for so long. The government really, they also got in early. I think there is a lot in terms of what you're saying to Marius on the foresight. Is that really what's driving that vision that no matter what the economic circumstances are, there's that vision, particularly on renewable energy? And will they keep it going?
I think let me just go back to one point that Marius made, which is about the role of government-related entities. He is absolutely right. If you look at what we have done, we have established the first wind project in the Middle East as a market entry into Jordan, by the way. That is not only the first wind project in the Middle East, but the first renewable energy project in Jordan. We've done the same as well in the UAE. So we act as a catalyst in these countries. Now, going back to your point about the price of oil, on that I might have to disagree a bit with Marius. I don't think, as an energy policy decision maker, when you decide about your energy mix, you cannot take into account this year's oil price or next year. The PPAs, the power purchase agreements that we have, are 20, 25 years. So, and we run our numbers at Masdar. Solar PV specifically is comparative with gas even as low as $20 price for oil, because they're both linked. So with that as a base, that gives you sufficient leeway for you to plan ahead, and you know that the price will only be lower. So, and I've even spoken to one of our partners, I can't quote their name, but they're an international IOC that are also in renewables, and I've asked the person openly, we've all felt the need to cut CapEx investments. And he acknowledged that. He said, yes, on our hydrocarbon business, we are cutting costs, but for renewables, we are not. So again, it shows you that there is acknowledgement that this sector has passed the point of being subsidized and is becoming much more commercially focused. And therefore, as part of the 20, 30-year plan, when you want to plan, you cannot decide based on this month's oil price or next year's oil price.
Indeed, Dr. Saidi, you've often said that the trade-off between economic growth and investing in clean tech. That's not there anymore. I mean, things have shifted and have changed. And perhaps you might address that, but also look at, the financing. You just briefly mentioned it there too. These are huge projects. I mean, we're talking billions of dollars. And, what can we do to actually make sure the financing is there with or without the government help? Because it has to be the public and private.
We mentioned government a bit earlier, maybe more on the investment side, but there's a very important role that governments have to play, and that's with respect to carbon pricing, which Marius was getting to. The fact that fossil fuels involve environmental costs, congestion, you drive more, you have more deaths on the road, all of that means that you need to price carbon correctly. And there have been studies already done as to how well you have to price carbon. And for our part of the world, you would have to add about 50 cents per liter, 50 cents per liter in the UAE and most of the GCC countries. In some countries, it goes up to 70 cents per liter. So what that does is, of course, it makes fossil fuels more expensive, and at the same time, it's going to give an incentive to go into renewables. Now, the fantastic opportunity we have today is that the cost of renewables, in particular solar and wind, has come down very substantially, something like 70%, 75% for solar. What we're entering really is, I call it the age of the Egyptian solar king, right? Ra, right? The Egyptians had it right some 2,000 years ago. It is the sun king who is important, the sun god who is important. So what we're going to enter into is an age in which solar is going to become much more prevalent than we've ever had it. It also means that it'll be ubiquitous. We will be able to use and wear solar. Our cars will become more electric. The estimates are that by 2030, something like 22 to 25% of our cars will be electric. That's extremely important because transportation uses up 12% of total energy. So as we go forward, what's going to be important is how do we attract the financing into renewables and into clean energy. Last year, something like $330 billion went into renewable and clean energy. We need to double that each year if we want to reach the COP21 targets. And what that means is that we need to be more innovative, and that started already. We now have things like green bonds. We, as the CEBC, for example, are working with DEWA, Dubai Supreme Energy Council, and with UAE government to introduce green sukuk. And these mean that you need more innovation in renewable energy finance. We have now yield cos, companies that can package assets and let you benefit from the yield of those renewable energy assets. You have solar securitizations, which is another instrument that you could use. But what we need to do is to go a bit further. And here I'd like to mention an opportunity for the UAE in particular. At the moment, if you look at a global level, there is no financial center that has emerged as the center for renewable energy finance. Here's a marvelous opportunity for the UAE, given that its strategy is focusing on renewables, to become the center for the financing of renewable energy and clean technology globally. You've got the UAE, you've got the Dubai International Financiers Center, you've got the Abu Dhabi Global Markets. All of those together have enormous expertise, and they could become the center for clean energy at a global level. Government needs to encourage that. So what I would say is that if we look at an agenda for decarbonization, and we need to put it in that context, we need to think, what is our strategy? It is decarbonization. That needs to mean several things. First, it has to be integrated. We need to think of a program which is multi-year. Second, we need to use pricing. That is, we need to use fiscal tools. I mentioned earlier subsidies. Those need to be phased out. But second, you bring in carbon pricing. Carbon pricing makes fossil fuels more expensive. Number three, you invest in intelligent infrastructure, in clean technology, in smart cities. And that forces you to become more integrated when you approach it. Number four, you go for clean energy financing, and you develop expertise in that. And number 5, and very critical because we haven't mentioned it, you need to partner with the private sector. Governments are great at putting in a framework, but what you need to do is to work with companies like First Solar, companies in Masdar, companies globally that are into clean technology, into clean energy.
Absolutely, and
These
it's really
public-private
making
partnerships
that,
are critical to move forward.
Jim, perfect on that one there. When you look at the economics of the industry, I mean, obviously this has to make good business sense. You know, you're not a charity, you're in this, and again, it just generally has to. Nothing's going to succeed in the long term unless it makes business sense. Looking at the cost of solar, do you see it coming down? And how do you look at the economics from a private point of view and looking at those partnerships?
We certainly see it continuing to come down, and we tend to take a view of our business in the industry of we're going to leave policy to the policymakers, and we're going to focus on the economics. And our goal as a company, and all of our planning as a company, is built upon the premise that we have reached the point and will continue to drive below the point where we are economic, irrespective of carbon pricing. We don't want to build a business model that is dependent upon public policy. We want to build a business model that is driven off of the fundamental economics, irrespective of public policy. As long as it's a relatively level playing field and we don't have a penalty, we can compete. Now, that's not true in all markets today, but it's true in many markets today. We view it that the private sector technology providers' responsibility is we need to make the transition cost-free to the economy, as versus the other opportunities or the alternatives that are available. So, you know, we as a company and many of our competitors and companies in other renewable industries such as wind have invested heavily in research and development. We continue to invest heavily in research and development. We've driven the cost down. When I took the helm of this company in 2012, we had a near-term goal of broadly in the world getting our levelized cost of electricity below 10 US cents per kilowatt hour. It's now below half that, and that's in a very short period of time, and it will go lower. That research and development is focused not just on the panel, but it's on the entire balance of system. It's also in capital markets developments. It's on the cost of capital, because one thing that's obvious, solar having no fuel cost, we're 100% capital. So cost of capital is a huge component of the total cost of electricity. So while we're working every day on reducing the cost of the panel, we're working every day on reducing the cost of the balance of system and the development costs. We've also got to be working on reducing the cost of capital. We've engaged in innovation, others in the industry. I think probably the biggest challenge is in the emerging markets. We have less well-developed capital markets in many of the emerging markets. The biggest barrier to truly low-cost renewables is going to be that cost of capital. And so that's where, in my view, we need the greatest level of innovation. But cost from the technology providers, the equipment providers standpoint is going to continue to come down. We view it as a religion within our organization that we have to relentlessly pursue lower cost. That's incumbent upon the participants in the industry. That's our job, and the total puzzle is to relentlessly drive down cost as we move forward.
Now, we just have less than 10 minutes, so I'm going to ask you all in a few minutes to look forward and see what the next step and what we can do. But Dr. Belhoul, if I can just pick up from what Jim is saying there, also looking at research and development. And to any of you who haven't been out to visit Masdar City, I really would encourage you, if you can take advantage during this conference, to get out there. It's really quite spectacular. And a lot of the work going on at the Masdar Institute, of course, it's what's driving, you know, the business too. But is there enough funding? Are you having enough partnerships in place? Is that appetite there that really is, you know, progressing the research and development, which will ultimately, you know, lead to bigger investment on a bigger picture?
So I think overall, the research has been growing, particularly from the private sector. The challenge we had when we first started the Masdar Institute was R&D was predominantly academic focused. There was that missing link between academia and industry. And when we set the strategy for Masdar Institute, the goal was to be commercially driven, to focus on the industry. And we've managed to raise a lot of private sector funding to solve issues on the ground. Today we have something called the Solar Hub, where we're investigating storage, different storage solutions, only because we know that, as Jim has mentioned, the price of PV will drop, but again, to add that baseload capacity, you need to find a solution for storage. And we're looking into different materials, including building materials, salt, including sand. You can actually use sand to as a thermal storage. So a lot of emphasis has been done on research. And also, if you take a step back from a policy side, as I mentioned in my speech, the UAE has committed to doubling its investment in R&D for renewables as part of the Vision Innovation. So I think from the bottom up, from the lab level to Abu Dhabi level to the UAE level, we're seeing continued investments in R&D when it comes to renewables. At the same time, from the private sector, we're seeing increased awareness around the value of R&D and how it can be applied to real-life applications.
So in the near term, what do you look, let's say in the next, because things change so quickly here as well, so we're looking at it. So if you had the wish list, what do you think needs to be done perhaps in the next year and in the next 5 years?
Look, there's so many challenges that we can tackle, but for us, first and foremost in the UAE, water is a critical issue. And for us in the UAE, water is linked with energy because most of our water is produced through desalination, which is highly energy intensive. So for us, again, solar is a priority, but that links back to energy. We do have an R&D project with a pilot in Ghantut where we are actually desalinating water using renewables. So focus is on water, but again, on storage. These are the two areas where I think Masdar Institute will continue to focus, and these are the ones that will really create an impact over the next 5 years.
And the immediate needs that's there. Jim, again, looking into the near term, the next year and 5 years, and we really only have a few minutes to wrap this up. What would you like to see? What do you need to see, regionally or indeed globally, that's going to move, the renewable agenda?
I think as we begin to see cost-effective storage come into the marketplace, and the technologies are emerging, manufacturers are coming to scale, and it does not take a lot of storage to significantly expand the market opportunity for photovoltaic. So that is one of the things we would like to see come along. The other is really availability of long-term capital for the emerging markets. We have a huge business in the US and lots of capital available. The same is true for Europe. Really, there's been lots of capital available in the Gulf region and the MENA, but when you look across Southeast Asia, the Indian subcontinent, Latin America, markets that have tremendous opportunity, capital is still a challenge in those markets, both in terms of its tenor and in terms of its pricing. And to the extent that we can develop market mechanisms, market opportunities to bring capital to bear, that will significantly broaden and deepen the opportunities for renewables around the globe.
Dr. Saidi, briefly, just in terms of what's on your big wish list in the next year or so.
I think for this part of the world, the important thing will be the phasing out of subsidies. That's going to be transformational for the economies of the region. Some industries will be hurt, but many industries can benefit from that. The second thing, I think, is carbon pricing. Starting to price a fuel much more expensive than what we've had so far. Number three, I think if I were a young Emirati right now and listening to Dr. Ahmed, I'd be very pleased. What I would like to do as a young man, if I was a young Emirati now, is to look ahead 20 years and say, okay, I need to get into science and technology, in renewables, in clean technology, and have it happen here, with the R&D happening and with government encouraging the markets to finance renewable energy. I think this is very feasible, and I think this could be transformational for the economies of the region. And it's not just as consumers of renewable energy technologies. We're privileged to be able to have sun nearly 365 days per year. So much of the research and development on solar, and including even on wind, could and should happen in this part of the world. And we need to devote much more resources to that. And if we do so, we could become exporters of the technology, not just consumers of the technology. Okay. And again, we're privileged in being well located next to developing economies, into Africa, into Asia. So if we develop solar in a big way, we can export the energy by linking networks. North Africa is close to Europe. We are close to Africa. We are also close to India and Asia. We can export by networking. But in addition to that, the technology itself will need to be exported,
Yes.
and we could become exporters of the technology. I think that would be a fantastic prize to look forward to.
Super. And the final word to our most optimistic chief economist in the world. How are things looking? You see all the great developments that can happen, but for you, when you look to the very short term and maybe 5 years out, what do you think has
That's
to
quite
happen?
an improvement in my
And you've only got like 1 minute
characterization.
to wrap that up for me. Yes.
Last time I was called the Prince of Darkness, so it's quite nice to be the most optimistic guy for a change. I'm going to start with government. It has a huge role to play, not just here, but globally. As Dr. Saidi said, in making carbon more expensive, maybe using the revenues from carbon taxation to subsidize clean energy, a double benefit to encourage clean energy. Second, I would mention innovation, not just on the technology front, but also on the financing front. An example was a deal we led in Cameroon, where Standard Chartered led it as an international bank. We used local banks for liquidity. The refinancing risk was taken by the government, and everything was done under a partial guarantee from the World Bank. So a lot of bodies coming together to finance these deals. And the final point I want to make, which might be more of wishful thinking from my side, is that we discussed so far the impact of the economy on green energy. I think we should also look at it the other way around. And it was mentioned
have
earlier
another
by
panel on
Dr.
that, yes.
Belhoul that
You're right, yes.
clean energy could add
Yeah.
1% to global GDP. 1% doesn't sound a lot, but if you think that we grow at 3%, if we go from 3 to 4, it is going to be quite a big deal. And one final thought is that the world economy today suffers from the lack of investment. Despite low interest rates, nobody's investing anywhere in the world. If regulation and policy encourage investment in clean energy, that could be an engine for growth for the world economy in years to come, and it will contribute much more than 1%.
Well, thank you for that, Marius, and it breaks my heart to have to close our conversation at that, because I could just feel we could just get started on this again. We have to wrap it up. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your insight. I really, really appreciate you starting off this. And we have 2 days more to go, so this really forms the discussion. Once again, thank you so much.